So today I wanted to go into all the details of my early tomato growing experiments for this year. So these are my furthest on, and the date today is the 30th, but we've actually had tomatoes since the middle of May, and these are red profusion. And I find that these are just a little bit earlier than my normal sort of main crop bush tomatoes, hanging basket tomatoes, which are tumbler. And I normally sow those about 5 weeks later. So, right, let me just go through the dates. So I start them off on the 3rd of February and plant them out 20th of March. In the interim, they've been in the house and they've been under grow lights for about, I would say, a month of that sort of 6 week period. And I think the grow lights are pretty important. So at the time of planting, they're reasonably sized plants, quite bushy, not flowering at that stage. And I've kept them in this greenhouse since the 20th of March, and I kept it above 10 degrees centigrade for all of that time. And I think that's pretty key for tomatoes, you know, especially early on in the year. And so I started harvesting 15th of May. So I've been pretty pleased with the results of that. And actually the quantity of tomatoes that I'm harvesting at the moment, I think is going to pay for the heating bill just on its own. And I've only got 5 hanging baskets full of tomatoes, and I've got some tubs outside, which I've moved outside for a kind of staggered harvest. I am very pleased though with the number of tomatoes on here, not just the number that are ripe, but the number that are coming, and they're looking pretty good. So let me just go through how I've looked after them. So once we actually had fruit set, I started to feed them. I didn't feed them at all until we had fruit set, and I've used this seaweed for one feeding, and I've used this Tomo Right for the second feeding, and then I've just used water so for the third. So let me just clarify that. I feed them every day, sometimes twice a day. So on day 1 I might use seaweed, on day 2 I'll use Tomorite, and on day 3 I'll use water, and then on day 4 I'll use seaweed. And the reason I'm using so much is because I'm watering them very little. Because I'm watering them every day, and I'm only watering, I don't know, like probably a third of that little watering can or something like that. That is not a lot of feed. And so whilst the instructions on your Tomorite or whatever might say feed them, you know, every 2 weeks or something like that, what I'm doing is I'm feeding them this every 3 days, but I'm feeding them, you know, a quarter of the amount of feed that Tomorite is expecting, because the hanging baskets are so small. So that's how I'm feeding them, and they're looking pretty good. Now the leaf quality is not perfect, but obviously it's good enough to generate a lot of tomatoes and ripen a lot of tomatoes. So that's how I'm feeding them. The hanging baskets themselves are really small, so they're only 11 inches on the inner diameter, so there's 11 inches of soil, and they're about 6 inches deep, and obviously they're not quite squared off, so there's a bit less at the bottom there. And the compost that I'm using is Erin multi-purpose, so cheapest compost that I can get basically from the garden centre. I quite like it though, because it's got quite a lot of wood and fibre in it, which means it's quite water retentive, and it's run out of feed long ago, so there was enough feed in there for 6 weeks apparently, and that's why I'm relying heavily on liquid feeds. By contrast, 5 weeks later I sowed my tumblers, and they're now in the polytunnels. They had pretty much the same treatment under grow lights for about 4 weeks. Sown on the 14th of March, planted out on the 30th of April in the polytunnel, bit of fleece over them if it was frosty. I'm expecting a mid-June harvest, so about a month later from those. There's a big difference though between them. The tomatoes are a bit bigger, but there's way less tomatoes on them. The plants aren't as bushy. There's probably, at this point in time, I don't know, maybe a third as many actual tomatoes on them as there is on these at the same stage of growth. So that's something to bear in mind. I think that's in the name, red profusion. They really do go kind of crazy in terms of the number of actual fruits. And again, that's probably again why it makes sense to just give them a little bit of extra feed by comparison with tumbler, which don't have as many fruits on them. So that, I think, is pretty much everything I can think of, other than obviously I've got them up here. So they're high up. It's the warmest place in the greenhouse. It's the lightest place in the greenhouse. And they've had sunlight not a lot of the time because it's been very dull and dark and all that sort of thing. But they've had plenty of light. They haven't had a lot of sunlight, but they've had plenty of light. By contrast, the ones outside, which are absolutely huge, have been underneath this grow light and perhaps have had too much light. The grow light was only on topping and tail in the day, so I think it came on at 6 o'clock, went off at 8 o'clock or something like that, and then came on again at, I can't remember now exactly, but say 6 o'clock, it went off at 8 o'clock. So they only had supplemental grow lights for about 4 hours of the day. But even so, I think these hanging basket ones are probably better, look healthier, more balanced plants really. Yeah, so I'm expecting these to run out of steam in about a month. I probably won't harvest every single tomato that's on these in that month, but I'll harvest a good number of them. And by then, the ones in the greenhouse will be ready. And I'll probably harvest those for about a month. And then by then, the main crop tomatoes, the cordon tomatoes, will be ready. Hopefully this demonstrates why it's much better, I think, to grow bush tomatoes, hanging basket tomatoes especially, for your early crop rather than cordons, because you're just getting such a huge harvest in a nice compact harvest window, and then you can clear them out and move on to your cordons later. I'm also going to do the same trick with these tomatoes for autumn, because I take my cordon tomatoes out in the polytunnel in October so that I can replant the polytunnel beds with all the winter crops. But I can keep, obviously, in this greenhouse, again, 5 or 6 hanging baskets of tomatoes going up in the roof space like this. And I'll probably have in the corners, probably 3 or 4, what we're going to do, sun gold probably, and we'll see how long I can keep those going to extend the season. We do buy tomatoes all year round when we're not harvesting them, so there is quite a substantial sort of financial benefit to being able to harvest £10 of probably more like 12 actually, £12 of tomatoes in value a week for an extra month. I've got a guide to growing tomatoes. I haven't quite updated it, but I might have updated it by the time this video goes live with this experiment's results. Anyway, take a look. I'll put a link to it down in the description. My name's Steve. This is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I will see you soon.